I would like to open this evening by introducing our special guest. Dr. Eric Lob is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. His research focuses on the intersection of development and politics in the Middle East. More specifically, his research explores how state and non-state actors in the region instrumentalize developments as a soft power mechanism to further the political interest both domestically and internationally. You're with us today to talk about your recently published book, Iran's Reconstruction's Jihad, Rural Development and Regime Consolidation After 1979, published by Cambridge University Press this year. I have to admit this book is a fascinating read. Dr. Lob outlines the developments that led to the establishment of the RJ, the initials of Reconstruction Jihad, as he refers to it throughout the book. And his book manages to cover both its vertical and horizontal developments, from a popular movement into a revolutionary organization, and finally a ministry, and its operation from the center to the rural periphery, and simultaneously from the Islamic Republic to other countries in the Middle East and Africa. Thank you very much for joining us. And the screen is yours.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Leora, for inviting me to give this talk on my book. And thank you to the Tel Aviv University Alliance Center for Iranian Studies for having me. I had given a presentation actually in 2016 at Tel Aviv University on Reconstruction Jihad's activities and Iran's activities, developmental activities primarily in Africa. And it's good to be back here, even if it's virtually, 4 or 5 years later. So thanks again for this opportunity. I'll pull up my PowerPoint. So yeah, once again, of course, the title of the book, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, is Reconstruction Jihad, Rural Development and Regime Consolidation After 1979. And the title of the cover of the book, I should say, actually has a 20 lira note on it, or Toman note that had the photograph of the organization. The currency is no longer in use or in circulation, but I was able to find an image of it and included it on the book. And the organization really is considered one of the most important revolutionary organizations in Iran after the Revolutionary Guard, and yet has received very little scholarly attention. So I'll talk briefly about the main question in the 20 minutes that I have, the argument of the book, the scholarly contribution that it makes, a little bit about the sources and methods, although I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, as Leora mentioned, as well as the major findings of the book, which is hard to cover in a 20-minute presentation. So I'll just cover maybe some of the main national or domestic findings of the organization versus leaving out maybe the transnational activities in Lebanon with Hezbollah and Africa and elsewhere. So in terms of the major research question that the book is trying to answer is explanations of regime resilience and even consolidation beyond just coercion. Because when Ayatollah Khomeini comes back to Iran in 1979, in February, the outcome of the revolution is still in doubt, and it's still like another 3 or 4 years in the early 1980s before the Islamic Republic will be able to consolidate power around Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers. And there's a whole host of competitors who had taken part in the coalition against the Shah, leftist groups, liberals, or so-called liberals, at least centrists, and traditional elites in provinces and villages. Of course, several months into the revolution, you have, less than 2 years into the revolution, you have invading Iraqi forces. Reconstruction Jihad will, of course, play a role in the war, which I know you have been talking extensively about this year. So there was a whole process and a role that the organization played in consolidating power in a way that really leveraged soft power, development, as opposed to just coercion. And when you read the literature on the Islamic Republic, a lot of it focuses on the coercive aspects of the regime. So, of course, a lot of attention to institutions and organizations like the IRGC, like the Basij, revolutionary courts. And I'm not arguing by any means that coercion wasn't a factor or even an important factor, just that there's scholars or scholarship and literature that downplays and even overlooks non-coercive mechanisms that the regime used to consolidate power and to remain resilient over the course of 4 decades, both nationally and transnationally or internationally. And again, just to show the importance of this organization, it was established just months into Khomeini's return to Iran, just shortly after the IRGC. So again, it showed what a priority and importance that the organization and that rural development had generally for the Islamic Republic and for the political and religious elites inside the government. And so really the book looks at how the Islamic Republic of Iran instrumentalizes development, rural development, and other forms of economic development to consolidate power at home and to project influence abroad. And I'm just going to keep an eye on the clock. Here is the slogan of the organization. For those of you who read Persian, Hame Baham, Jahad-e Sazendegi. Jahad-e Sazendegi is the name of the organization in Persian. Hame Baham is all together. So in the rhetoric of the organization, the discourse of the organization, its leaders, its activists, the speeches that Khomeini gives about the organization and other political elites, there's this emphasis early on a collective spirit that we're going to do this all together. And also there's this, what I refer to theoretically as boundary activation, because I think part of the importance of the organization is that it's a continuation, actually, which Khomeini and the others don't really talk about, of the Shah's policies, that the Shah during the White Revolution between 1962 and 1979 had deployed his own organizations to the provinces and villages known as the Corps, as the Sepah, the Literacy, Hygiene, and Extension Corps. And so this organization really, the way it's framed is that it's differentiating itself in terms of repairing the alleged destruction that the Shah and these organizations had caused to the provinces and villages, even though they had themselves made contributions. So the organization and Khomeini, other elites, are really trying, even though they're imitating the Shah's activities and organizations, they try to differentiate themselves. And again, through this collective spirit of all together, Hame Baham, which, if you read the book, it talks about over time how this collective spirit becomes eroded and how people become increasingly individualistic, not just within the organization, but in Iran as a whole, as this revolutionary fervor and elan begins to decrease over time. So again, the book looks at consolidation and resilience beyond just coercion and repression, and again, arguing that coercion and repression is an important aspect of the Islamic Republic's state formation and nation building, but adding these non-coercive developmental aspects to the equation. And really, it's the first book. There have been other works in English and in Persian that have looked at Reconstruction Jihad as a central unit of analysis, but more so on the developmental side. And the economic and social side. And this really brings the politics into the fold, and also situates the organization and presents it as a microcosm of, because I look at both the organizational changes of the organization over the last 40 years, also the changes of its leaders and activists and how they evolve into governmental officials and bureaucrats and important figures in the polity, in the economy, in the society, but also looking at how the macro and micro changes of the organization reflect broader changes in the Islamic Republic itself over the last 40 years, because you could see a lot of parallels in the trajectory of the organization, the evolution of the organization, and that of the Islamic Republic itself over the last 40 years. And it really sheds a lot of light on different aspects of the Islamic Republic. The mobilization that occurred during and after the revolution, how the state consolidated, again, the organization being a soft power mechanism of consolidation alongside more hard power elements like the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, and other institutions. The role that the organization played in the war, then it becomes part of the Iranian bureaucracy. And fortunately, I was able to access that bureaucracy, and it revealed a lot of interesting aspects of it. The political factionalism that existed very early on, and how it impacted the organization's evolution, but how the organization also leveraged that factionalism, played different political elites off of each other. For example, played Khomeini off of Prime Minister Bazargan in the beginning to try to gain recognition, resources, and responsibilities from the state and expand. Associationalism. After the organization became a ministry, leaders and activists of the organization and even war veterans formed associations that still exist today to commemorate the organization and to push certain political, social, and economic agendas forward. Of course, the organization played an important role in Iran's foreign policy, in Lebanon with Hezbollah, in Africa, and other parts of the Muslim and developing world, inside and outside the Middle East. And then finally, cultural production. When you even set foot in Iran recently, you see that there's lots of literature, there are commemorative events. Every year in June, when the organization is established, they have a week-long event to commemorate the organization. They call it the Week of Jihad. There's conferences that are organized around this organization, or at least idealized conceptions of the organization. There's even when I was in Iran, they had been establishing the Museum of the Holy Defense and Resistance Culture to commemorate the Iran-Iraq War. And Construction Jihad, or Reconstruction Jihad, occupies an important wing of that museum and shows that the activities that it had performed during the war. And so methodologically, the book relies on extensive interviews with former members of the organization, development experts, rural residents in Iran and in Lebanon, because the organization exists there now as an affiliate of Hezbollah. This research was conducted between 2009 and 2012. I visited also to complement and to supplement the interviews numerous archives and libraries in Iran and Lebanon, and even the Library of Congress in the US was very valuable in that regard. These were some of the areas, as Leora had mentioned, where I visited in Iran to try to conduct as really extensive fieldwork as possible. And, to be honest, I just went where I could go. There were areas where I wasn't able to go to, or I was advised not to go to, that are more politically sensitive, in the Kurdish areas in the West, in Sistan and Baluchistan in the East. And really where I went mostly was, as you can see, in the center of the country, up and down the north and south. Meeting with academics, meeting with students, and other people who welcomed me. And really it was a snowball sampling technique where different people refer you to other people. And of course, there's methodological pitfalls and issues that we can discuss that are associated with that technique. But at the same time, you're operating in a constrained environment, and you have to basically, if you're an athlete, do what the defense allows you to do, essentially, as the expression goes. And so, in terms of the findings, as I discussed, the organization doesn't just show the changes that happen pre and post revolutionary Iran, but also the continuities. This organization, as I said, was very much, even if this was denied by a lot of people, an extension of the Shah's policies in the 1960s and 70s. And very much performed similar activities as the Shah's core. And yet these leaders and activists and politicians and religious figures did everything they could in their rhetoric discourse to try to differentiate the organization from those organizations that the Shah had established, and even frame it as a mission to repair and to reconstruct the damage, allegedly, that the Shah had caused to the provinces and villages, as I mentioned earlier. And another important point too is really the bidirectionality of the mobilization and the establishment. That very often in the literature on revolutionary Iran and the Islamic Republic, it almost sounds like it's always the elites that are pulling the strings. But when we look at the Reconstruction Jihad's establishment, its expansion, you actually see that oftentimes it's the activists, the leaders that had taken part in the revolution that are putting pressure on the elites, actually, Khomeini and others, and playing them off against each other, taking advantage of a factionalized state to put themselves in a better position, like I said, to gain recognition, to gain responsibilities, to gain resources from the state, as it is established as a revolutionary organization and then transitions to a ministry, which created a lot of controversy, and we could talk more about that. So the bidirectionality of this mobilization and expansion is important, and I think an important part of the book, because it shows that the processes are both top down and bottom up. It's not just elites pulling the strings and determining the fate of the Islamic Republic, but the activists are doing it from below as well. And so, as I said, the Reconstruction Jihad is not just exploiting factionalism, but also the dual structure of the state. When the Islamic Republic is established, you have all these parallel institutions. You have, of course, the office of the prime minister. You also have the Revolutionary Council, and you have these parallel revolutionary bodies that the Reconstruction Jihad takes advantage of to put itself in a better position when Bazargan, when the prime minister, when the bureaucracy is working actually against Construction Jihad and the other revolutionary organizations. Because what Reconstruction Jihad and the other revolutionary organizations represent is actually a threat to the bureaucracy and interfering and overlapping with its resources and responsibilities. So you see this struggle actually between the prime minister, the bureaucracy on one side, and revolutionary organizations like Reconstruction Jihad and the revolutionary councils and committees on the other side, and the Islamic Republican Party against Bazargan's party. And so, as I said, from a bottom-up process, the Reconstruction Jihad's leaders and activists influenced Khomeini and the Islamic Republican Party to establish the organization as a parallel organization in competition and sometimes cooperation with the ministries as they're being purged and as they're being restructured within the revolutionary state. And during this time, you have Reconstruction Jihad with other revolutionary organizations undermining and marginalizing this center left. Bazargan, Beni Sadr, who's eventually the president, who's eventually impeached, and other members of their parties and groups, and bringing a more radicalized agenda to the forefront. And so the organization really expands during two critical moments. You have the Cultural Revolution between 1980 and 1983, where the organization is not just involved in rural development activities, roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, medication, vaccination, and other rural development activities, but also ideological activities. With this agenda of the Cultural Revolution, a lot of activists, leaders of the organization, and there's of course debates within the organization how much time, energy, and resources they should be devoting to this, but it gets more and more ideological, where the goal becomes Islamizing the countryside through clerical sermons, through distribution of Qurans, religious texts, through prayer groups and study sessions, and even constructing more and more religious structures like mosques, seminaries, congregation halls, and structures like that. So, the Cultural Revolution in ways accelerates the organization's expansion and also its ideological activities. And as I mentioned, so does the Iran-Iraq War, because it breathes new life into the organization. It gives it a new mission of providing logistical support to the forces on the front. Basically replicating or performing similar activities in the villages now on the war front, building the critical infrastructure that the Iranian forces need, providing it with different forms of logistical support, and that I can get into in more detail if you'd like in the Q&A. And really, this was a mechanism that the state uses more and more and leverages more and more to penetrate the villages, where at the time in 1979 represented over 50% of the population. So this is a very important constituency. And as I said, the organization is active in these different areas: infrastructure, hygiene, education, religion, and culture, and in many ways resembling, if not even imitating, what the Shah had been doing in the 1960s and 70s. Here's a photograph of what was known as the Reconstruction Jihad's trench builders without trenches. Sangar Sazane bi Sangar. So these were the young men, part of Reconstruction Jihad, because this was trench warfare during the Iran-Iraq War. These were the young men who were going out to build the trenches, whether they were being used to house troops or being used in combat. And they were referred to as the trench builders without trenches because they didn't have trenches to protect themselves while they were digging trenches to protect Iranian forces. And so, they're very much commemorated in Iran to this day. They had lost an estimated 3,000 of their forces. And when you go to the Museum of the Holy Defense and resistant culture, they're very much honored for what they did with the trenches and other activities. And so when you look at the organization's transition, and you could see this very much as a broader trend in the Islamic Republic in the 1980s. The organization becomes a ministry in 1983, and you see processes of demobilization, of institutionalization, of professionalization occurring not just within Reconstruction Jihad, but lots of other revolutionary organizations and institutions. And so Reconstruction Jihad, just 4 or 5 years into its existence, or 3 or 4 years, transitions into this ministry. And a lot of that has to do, and a lot of members at the time didn't want to become a ministry because they saw themselves as competing against the ministries. And the narrative that had been developed is that the ministries, the bureaucrats, some of whom were still affiliated with the Shah, were sitting in Tehran, drinking their tea, collecting their paychecks, not going out and doing anything, and that these young activists who were filled with revolutionary and religious fervor, they were the ones that were getting things done, even if that wasn't necessarily always true, or even if they made a lot of mistakes along the way because they lacked planning, they lacked experience. But nonetheless, this was the narrative, this anti-bureaucratic narrative that had developed. And so a lot of them were disenchanted or disillusioned with having become part of the bureaucracy, even though there were other members of the organization that lobbied for it because they wanted the same status, they wanted the same privileges, they wanted paychecks, they wanted promotions. And so this was actually a very contentious, controversial process. And the book really looks at the pros and cons of this evolution in terms of giving the organization more stability, more certainty, more financial transparency and accountability, because now its budgets were formally scrutinized and approved by the parliament. It couldn't just go out and do what it wanted with its resources. So there was a measure of transparency and accountability. There was also a process of professionalization and expertise. And they talk about often this dichotomy or this binary in the Islamic Republic between ta'ahud, commitment, and takhasus, expertise. And so particularly, when Rafsanjani comes on the scene, there's this emphasis on we have to transition from commitment to expertise. We have to become experts and we have to do things the right way. And you see this cultural infuse itself in the Reconstruction Jihad, investing in research and development and recruitment and training. And so there were a lot of positives to this that emerged through this transition, but there were also negative outcomes that people talk about. Former activists of the organization, current bureaucrats who were frustrated, the level of centralization, as I mentioned, this deviation from collectivization to individualism, where people cared like the bureaucrats of the Shah. At least that was the narrative that developed. People started emulating them and caring more about their paychecks and their career advancement and their promotions, and less about getting things done and improving the country. The corporatization that happened, the Reconstruction Jihad either poached companies or corporations from other ministries or developed their own. And so there became a profit-seeking dimension to all of this, and a capitalistic dimension that was frowned upon, even though, of course, it expanded the organization's budgets and resources. Redundancies as well, where you had the ministry doing things that other ministries were doing and creating lots of inefficiencies, red tape, where the complaints were that we can't just go out to the villages and do things anymore. We have to get a signature. We have to get approval from our bosses. Things have become very hierarchical and stifling and stagnant. And then finally, there's also, and this also is why I think Reconstruction Jihad is a microcosm of the Islamic Republic, there became a duality to the organization that even existed before it became a ministry, where to this day in the ministry, which is merged with the Ministry of Agriculture because of the redundancies that existed and efficiencies that existed between them, you have two leaders. You have a minister who's appointed by the president with a parliamentary vote of confidence in the cabinet. And then you also have a representative of the supreme leader. And so sometimes they may cooperate, but at other times they have different agendas. And they have, different personnel within the ministry who are reporting to them and who are more in tune or more inclined with their agenda. And so this creates duality within the organization, a lot of tensions and conflict. And so, these are some of the issues that emerged as the organization evolved over time as part of the bureaucracy. And individually, what this did, again, it created pros and cons. On the one side, you had individuals who talked about having fatigue and apathy and disillusionment with all this bureaucracy and stagnancy, careerism, individualism. A common outcome, actually, that you see among revolutionary activists, not just in Iran, but globally, in terms of, wearing down over time, feeling that there's been a deviation, an abandonment from revolutionary values and aspirations, even utopic ones. And then on the flip side, and I mentioned earlier that there were members of the organization who lobbied for bureaucratization because they wanted to reap the benefits of it. They experienced the political and social mobility. And so when you go to Iran today, you will see these individuals in corner offices, top officials in bureaucracy, in the economy, presidents of banks and companies, state companies, semi-state or parastatal companies. Even when you look at President Rouhani's cabinet, a lot of these cabinet members were actually some of the first leaders of Reconstruction Jihad. So and some of these former members and leaders of the organization are very proud of this, and they talk about how we've advanced and how we now occupy major positions in the state. And they're not they don't shy away from talking about those achievements. But you always see these tensions in these processes and outcomes within Reconstruction Jihad and the wider Islamic Republic itself. Of course, what I didn't discuss was the transnational activity of the organization in Lebanon and Africa that we could discuss more, methodology and other elements of the book that I'm happy to address. So thanks again, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Okay, so thank you very much for trying to put everything into a very concise picture. One of the things that I would like to stress, and perhaps you can say a little bit more about it, we are talking about a ministry, an organization that in the book you mentioned, I believe that it's pretty much in the introduction, and you say that it's more or less equal the Revolutionary Guards in terms of its importance and input for the Islamic Republic. Do we know the size or how many people are involved? Or because I believe that there are several sectors involved in this ministry. There are builders and drivers and maintenance forces. It's a very complex organization.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really important point, and it touches on two questions. First of all, the structure, how the organization was structured. And, in the beginning, it was a lot less formal when it was, even before it became a revolutionary organization in the months after the revolution through to the ministry, you see it become more and more formalized and structured around these different departments of infrastructure or construction, of agriculture, of education and culture, of medicine, and becoming more and more specialized over time. And even though there's a paradox and an irony here, even though the slogan was all together, there was lots of divisions within those organizations. One of the things that came out of the interviews was, if I'm interviewing someone from the construction or agriculture side of things or infrastructure, the engineers, there was this superiority complex. We were really doing the core of the organization. And then, if you were talking to someone in the education department or the religion and cultural department, it was them that was really doing what was most important. And, there was even within the organization, there was a competition within these divisions. Not just saying, well, what we're doing is the most important thing, but also a competition of resources, because ultimately you had the organization that had its central council in Tehran that was distributing resources to the provinces that were then distributing resources to the villages. And so each department or division within the organization had to justify what they were doing and make it sound like what they were doing was the most important aspect of the organization, to try to continue to get those resources and responsibilities from the provinces and then from the center in Tehran. So this led to a lot of actual tension and competition between these divisions and departments, even if the slogan was, we're doing this all together. That wasn't really necessarily the reality. And then the second part of your question, the relationship between Reconstruction Jihad and the IRGC, is that initially, these are both young, evolving organizations. And they're not just in central Iran where people are a little more congenial towards them, but they're going out to the western part of Iran where there's ethnic and religious conflict and uprisings, as well as to the east where they're not necessarily welcomed and they're even attacked. Even before the Iran-Iraq war, they're under attack, and they talk about this in the interviews. And the IRGC is seen as this force that's going to try to keep these movements and militias in line. And the Reconstruction Jihad is seen as the soft power side that's going to try to win the hearts and minds. And the first representative of the Reconstruction Jihad, the Supreme Leader's representative, Natik Nouri, who's still a very important figure in the Islamic Republic, mentions this in his memoirs, that they were trying to divide the population using development and soft power and co-optation to try to divide the population of these areas from these movements and militias and try to win them over to the new revolutionary state. And this didn't always work. Reconstruction Jihad members talked about being under attack and relying on the IRGC and security forces to help them. And this became, so in the beginning, they were on this relatively equal footing. But over time, you actually see that the organization becomes more securitized. And I published an article in 2019 showing that development as an enterprise in Iran becomes more politicized, becomes more securitized, with the IRGC and the Basij playing more important roles in that area. And even making Reconstruction Jihad, which is now part of the bureaucracy, almost in some ways, at times they compete, at times, they have to defer to the, let's say, agenda of the security establishment in terms of what the political purposes are of delivering development projects and services to different parts of Iran. So there's definitely a change over time, even if it's not always openly discussed in this dynamic and division of labor in the country, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Eric, for your fascinating presentation. First of all, I would like to continue the second part of Leora's question about the relations between the IRGC and the Construction Jihad. And I would like, if you have specific, if you have any, if you can elaborate on the specific relationship between the Reconstruction Jihad, and Khatam al-Anbiya, which is the economic part of the IRGC. Because as it is, especially since it became governmental ministry, it seems to me that there would be some competition between the government and the IRGC. And my second question is if you can elaborate especially about its activity in Syria and Iraq, if there is activity in those two countries. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for your questions. No, absolutely. And so, what I was saying a little bit earlier about, as the security establishment, the IRGC, gains more and more recognition, responsibilities, resources from the state, and even through its own means, its agenda and its institutions begin not just to compete with, but even to supersede Reconstruction Jihad. You know, what happens is in 2001, and this also was controversial, and the book talks about it extensively, but there was a merger between Reconstruction Jihad and the Ministry of Agriculture. And, you know, they were competitors for many years, and all of a sudden they're being asked to sit down and to work together. And so what ends up happening is when you visit the ministry now of the agricultural jihad, which is now the byproduct of that merger, the agenda is more on agricultural activities, and even less so on rural development and construction and infrastructure. And that portfolio, as you correctly said, has gone to Khatam al-Anbiya. And so I would say that, you know, as that organization was established and expanded under the auspices of the IRGC, it was really them and their engineers, and some of their engineers may be former Reconstruction Jihad members. I can't confirm that, but you know, they're the ones who really take the lead, I would say, in infrastructure. Much more so than you know, Reconstruction Jihad, which is now folded into the Ministry of Agriculture, which deals with things like agriculture and fisheries, both domestically but even transnationally, where they do cooperation with other countries in those areas. And so that's the way I would answer the first part of your question. The second part of your question is that I have actually written an article on Reconstruction Jihad, which is now a branch. At least the Reconstruction Jihad that we're talking about now in Syria is a branch of the IRGC's Quds Force. But it's also the same idea. It's the same model in terms of using reconstruction development and humanitarian aid to, again, as a soft power mechanism to help Iran and its allies and the Syrian government consolidate territory and to win hearts and minds, or at least gain popular support in different conflict zones in Syria. And so since at least 2015, the Islamic Republic and the IRGC has been using this model to do that. My article details these activities, the activities, the processes, the outcomes, even unintentional ones, because it has been successful to some extent, but it's also aggravated Iranians and Syrians and even others in the region for other reasons that we could discuss further if you want. The problem with academia is things take a long time. So hopefully that article will come out relatively soon. The journal keeps pushing it back. I've presented it a couple of times, but I'm more than happy to talk to you more about the details of that. The Iraq piece, I haven't seen the organization mentioned by name as Reconstruction Jihad, but I do understand that the IRGC is undertaking similar efforts in Iraq. Perhaps not using the same name or concept, but similar activities and structures. And if you do have more information on that, I'd welcome it, because I haven't been able to find as much quality data on Iraq as I have on Syria. So thanks for those questions.
Sure. First, thank you so much for a fascinating and illuminating presentation. It was a pleasure to hear. I have a different kind of question, and it's more oriented toward the experiences of rural communities that were engaging with this organization. So I'm curious how they perceive their contribution to their communities, whether or not the organization was taking some cues from the failure of the White Revolution. In other words, were they prioritizing drawing recruits from these environments so that they could be more appealing when they were engaging with them? And also, did these rural communities see, especially between 1980 and 83, when Reconstruction Jihad was more independent, did they see them as an independent organization, or did they consider them as part and parcel of the Islamic Republic? In other words, was that was their mission as a sort of independent organization understood by the communities that they were trying to support?
Great question. There's a lot of ways, different ways that I can answer it. And the book actually tries to do a comparison. I mean, I don't really have hard data on the developmental outcomes of the Shah versus the Reconstruction Jihad, and there's even a student who approached me who specializes in econometrics. Is there even data out there that we could do on that? But nonetheless, you do see where, compared to the Shah's organizations, where the organization succeeded and where it failed, right? And where it maybe learned some lessons and where it didn't. So one of the big things is that they talk about, as you said, of leveraging local labor. They called it Nirohaye Bumi. And a lot of these members of the organization were from these villages and from these provinces, and it wasn't just this revolutionary and religious mission to improve reconstruction and development and even, Islamize, however that was going to be done, the villages and provinces, but they had a personal mission to improve their provinces and villages because some of them were from there. And really had a personal stake and had leveraged their kinship networks and other networks to recruit and to expand the organization. And so, that's one aspect, I think, where they succeeded more versus the Shah Sepah, which were largely urban youth who were trying to avoid military service or use this as a substitute for military service, going out, and there was kind of these disparities between, the urban youth and the villagers, and they weren't fully trusted. On the other hand, as you asked, the organization, very quickly becomes a revolutionary organization. It's more independent in between February and June. And by June, it's already becoming an official revolutionary organization with state budgets, they're getting cars from different ministries to go out to the villages with government license plates. And so, in some areas they're being, welcomed. The villagers, by the way, are not these passive recipients of these services and projects, but are also positioning themselves, right? And also there's an interesting transformation of social hierarchies in the villages as a result of this. The younger generation, the more revolutionary, religious or pious-minded villagers are able to position themselves and get in with the organization versus the older, traditional hierarchy, the village elders who are being seen as counter-revolutionary or disconnected from the revolutionary generation. And so this leads to, hierarchical social transformations that are interesting as well. This was something that rural sociologists really really wanted me to look at, not to look at villagers as passive recipients, but how they position themselves. And so getting back to that other point about going to more contentious areas like the Kurdish areas, Sistan, Baluchistan, Azerbaijan, where there were these uprisings, arriving in cars with government license plates made them targets. Right. And so they talk about, pulling up to these villages with the, government issued cars, and all of a sudden, having stones thrown at them or worse, getting shot at. And so, even if they had a less formal organizational structure, early on, it was hard for the organization to disassociate themselves from the government or the state, even if they were trying to be this anti-bureaucratic, alternative model to development. And, the last thing I'll say is that while they may have been leveraging local people in their efforts and being successful versus what the Shah had done, where they emulated with the Shah is that as it became more formalized, the model became increasingly top down. And it was really, even though they talked about participatory development, musharakati, they were beginning more and more to impose. It became more of a distributive, approach. And so this created a lot of, dissatisfaction and resentment among villagers that their input wasn't being taken into account enough, like what the Shah had done, and that these projects were just being imposed, even if it didn't necessarily correspond to the priorities of the villages.
I suggest everyone, if you're left with unanswered questions, you're more than welcome to read the details in Eric's book, which is, again, a fascinating read. So thank you very much, Eric, for the time and for sharing the input from your book, and a lot of success with your further research. And of course, we will be happy to stay in touch.